boring history for sleep. We explore medieval punishments very, very slowly. Welcome to another boring journey through the corridors of history. Tonight, we embark on an extended, thoroughly detailed exploration of justice and punishment in the medieval world, specifically examining the fictional barony of St. Alicis. For the next 2 hours, we'll drift slowly and methodically through the intricate tapestry of feudal law, examining each thread with the kind of careful attention that allows the mind to wander and eventually settle into restful sleep. As we begin this unhurried journey, imagine yourself transported to a time when justice was not codified in vast libraries of legal precedent, but rather lived in the memories of elders, the customs of communities, and the personal judgment of lords. A time when the line between earthly and divine justice blurred into one continuous spectrum of authority. A time when a baron's word could mean life or death, freedom or bondage, honor or eternal shame. Our exploration tonight will take us through 12 comprehensive sections, each building upon the last like stones in a medieval wall, solid, methodical, and designed to last. We'll begin with the broadest concepts of lordly authority and gradually narrow our focus to the most intimate details of dungeon life, execution rituals, and the quiet aftermath of justice served. Allow yourself to settle comfortably as we begin this journey. There's no need to retain every detail. Simply let the steady flow of information wash over you like a gentle stream. If you find your attention drifting, that's perfectly natural, and indeed precisely the intention. History, after all, is most restful when it unfolds at its own unhurried pace. Section 1. The Lord as Judge and Moral Authority. Picture, if you will, a stone keep rising from morning mist, its walls weathered by centuries of rain and wind. Within those walls sits Baron Conan of St. Alicis, a man whose authority extends far beyond the simple ownership of land. In the medieval understanding of the world, his power to judge and punish derives not from any constitution or parliament, but from God himself, a divine mandate passed down through the great chain of being that links the lowliest peasant to the highest angels. This concept, known as the divine right of lordship, formed the bedrock of medieval justice. It wasn't merely a convenient fiction designed to maintain power, though it certainly served that purpose. Rather, it represented a genuine belief system that permeated every level of society. The baron was not simply a landowner who happened to possess judicial authority. He was God's appointed guardian of order in his particular corner of creation. Consider the weight of this responsibility as it would have rested upon Baron Conan's shoulders. Each morning, as he broke his fast with coarse bread and watered wine, he knew that petitioners would soon gather in his hall. Some would come with disputes over boundaries, where one man's strip of land ended and another's began. Others would bring accusations of theft, assault, or worse. Each case required not just judgment, but the appearance of divine wisdom. The ideal of the just Lord was carefully cultivated through centuries of Christian teaching and chivalric literature. A good baron, the priest would say, must embody the virtues of Solomon: wisdom, patience, and an unwavering commitment to truth. He must protect the weak, particularly widows and orphans who had no other defender. He must show mercy where appropriate, but also demonstrate the stern hand of justice when evil threatened the peace of his domain. In practice, of course, the reality often fell far short of this ideal. Many barons were more concerned with their hunting rights than with the grievances of their villagers. Some were cruel, using their judicial power to settle personal scores or extract additional revenues. Others were simply incompetent, lacking the education or temperament to parse complex disputes. But Baron Conon, at least according to the Chronicles of St. Aloysius, strove to meet the high standard set by church and custom. The physical setting of baronial justice reflected its divine sanction. When holding court, Baron Conon would often position himself beneath religious imagery, perhaps a carved crucifix or a painted scene of the Last Judgment. This visual reminder served multiple purposes. For the Baron himself, it was a sobering reminder that he too would one day face judgment. For the accused, it reinforced the sacred nature of the proceedings. And for the community at large, it bound together earthly and heavenly authority in a single, comprehensible image. The concept of justice in this period differed markedly from modern notions of blind equality before the law. Medieval justice was inherently hierarchical, with different standards applying to different social classes. This wasn't seen as corruption or unfairness, but rather as the natural order of things. Just as God had created different orders of angels, each with their own duties and privileges, so too had he ordained different estates of humanity. A knight accused of theft would face a vastly different process than a peasant charged with the same crime. The knight might demand trial by combat, invoking his right to prove his innocence through force of arms. He would be judged by his peers, other knights who understood the particular honor codes and obligations of their class. His punishment, if found guilty, would likely preserve his life and status, perhaps involving a fine or temporary exile, rather than the brutal corporal punishments meted out to commoners. The peasant, by contrast, could expect summary justice. His case might be heard and decided within minutes. His punishment would be swift, public, and painful, designed not just to punish him individually, but to serve as a warning to others of his station. This disparity wasn't hidden or apologized for. It was simply the way things were, as natural and unquestioned as the turning of the seasons. Baron Conon's authority extended beyond criminal matters into virtually every aspect of life in his domain. He adjudicated disputes over marriage contracts, inheritance claims, and commercial agreements. He set the dates for harvest and determined the allocation of common lands. He could commandeer labor for public works, set prices in the market, and even regulate the brewing of ale. In essence, he combined in his person the roles that would today be divided among judges, legislators, executives, and regulatory agencies. This concentration of power might seem tyrannical to modern sensibilities, but it made sense within the medieval worldview. The Baron was not just a judge, but a father figure to his people, stern when necessary, protective when threatened, and ultimately responsible for the spiritual as well as material welfare of his subjects. The very word Lord derives from the Old English hlaford, meaning bread keeper or loaf ward, one who provides sustenance and protection. The religious underpinning of baronial justice extended to the very words used in legal proceedings. Oaths were not mere formalities, but sacred bonds that invoked divine witness. To swear falsely was not just perjury, but blasphemy, risking not just earthly punishment, but eternal damnation. This is why oath-taking often involved physical contact with holy relics, perhaps a fragment of a saint's bone or a splinter from the true cross. The tactile connection to the sacred realm made the consequences of lying viscerally real. Moving slowly through these concepts, we begin to see how justice in medieval Saint Aliquis operated on multiple levels simultaneously. It was practical, addressing the day-to-day disputes and crimes that arose in any community. It was social, reinforcing hierarchies and relationships that held the feudal order together. It was theatrical, providing public spectacle that both entertained and educated. And it was spiritual, serving as a constant reminder of divine judgment and the moral order of the universe. As we prepare to delve deeper into the specific mechanisms of this justice system, take a moment to imagine yourself in Baron Conan's Great Hall on a typical morning of judgment. The air is thick with smoke from the central hearth. Dogs prowl beneath the tables searching for scraps. Petitioners crowd near the entrance, some rehearsing their grievances in whispered tones, others standing in sullen silence. The Baron himself sits in his great chair, perhaps running his fingers through his beard, as he prepares to assume once again the awesome responsibility of speaking justice in God's name. This scene, repeated countless times across countless baronies throughout the medieval period, formed the foundation of law and order in an age before police forces, professional prosecutors, or written legal codes. It was personal, immediate, and inescapable, much like the justice it dispensed. Section 2. The Unwritten Constitution of Medieval Life. As we continue our leisurely exploration of medieval justice, let us turn our attention to the fascinating world of customary law, that vast, unwritten body of rules and precedents that govern daily life in places like St. Aliquis. Unlike our modern legal systems, with their libraries full of statutes and case law, medieval justice relied primarily on human memory and oral tradition, creating a system both remarkably flexible and surprisingly durable. Imagine, if you will, a world without law books, without court reporters, without written precedents to guide judicial decisions. In such a world, the law literally lived in the minds and memories of the community. This was customary law, not written on parchment, but woven into the very fabric of social life, passed down through generations like family heirlooms or traditional recipes. The guardians of this legal tradition were the elders of the community, men whose long lives and good memories made them walking libraries of local custom. In St. Aliquis, one such figure was Sire Eustace, the Baron Seneschal. Picture him as a man in his 6th decade, his hair white as fresh snow, his eyes still sharp despite the years. Sire Eustace had served 3 generations of the Baronial family, and his memory stretched back to cases decided when Baron Conan's grandfather held the seat of justice. When a dispute arose that required knowledge of precedent, all eyes would turn to Sire Eustace. He might stroke his beard thoughtfully, his eyes focusing on some distant point, as he recalled a similar case from decades past. In the year of the great storm, he might begin, when the mill bridge washed away, there was a dispute much like this one between the families of Montmorency and Beauchamp, and thus would begin a recitation that was part legal precedent, part local history, and part moral instruction. The role of memory in medieval law cannot be overstated. Since nothing was written down, everything depended on the ability of community members to recall past decisions, ancient boundaries, and traditional obligations. This created a legal system that was inherently conservative. Changes happened slowly, if at all, and innovation was viewed with suspicion. After all, if something had been done a certain way since time immemorial, who was any one person to change it? This reliance on memory also meant that legal proceedings often took on the character of communal storytelling sessions. Witnesses would be called not just to testify about recent events, but to confirm or deny the recollections of how things had always been done. An elderly villager might be asked to remember where the boundary stones had stood in his youth, or how his grandfather had described the fishing rights in the village stream. Consider the practical implications of such a system. Every legal decision became a performance, a public affirmation of community memory. The law was not something external to the community, imposed from above or from outside. Rather, it emerged from the community itself, from its collective memory and shared understanding of right and wrong, proper and improper, traditional and innovative. Father Gregoire, the parish priest of Saint-Aliki, represented another crucial source of legal knowledge. While Sire Eustace embodied secular custom, Father Gregoire brought to bear the vast tradition of canon law, the law of the Church. Picture him in his small study, surrounded by the few precious manuscripts the parish possessed. Unlike most of his parishioners, Father Gregoire could read and write, giving him access to legal texts that others could only hear recited. The relationship between customary law and canon law was complex and sometimes contentious. Canon law claimed universal authority, deriving from scripture, papal decrees, and the decisions of church councils. It dealt with matters of faith and morals, marriage and legitimacy, oaths and obligations. In theory, it superseded local custom whenever the two conflicted. In practice, accommodations were usually found that preserved both the letter of canon law and the spirit of local tradition. Father Gregoire might spend hours poring over his manuscripts, searching for precedents that could guide Baron Conan's decisions. The Decretum of Gratian, compiled in the 12th century, attempted to harmonize centuries of sometimes contradictory church law. The priest would trace his finger along the Latin text, his lips moving silently as he translated the complex legal arguments into wisdom applicable to the immediate case at hand. The preservation and transmission of customary law required constant vigilance. Since nothing was written down, the death of a knowledgeable elder could mean the loss of crucial legal knowledge. Communities developed various strategies to prevent such losses. Important precedents would be recited at public gatherings, embedding them in collective memory. Young men training for positions of authority would be required to memorize vast amounts of legal tradition, much as modern students might memorize poetry or mathematical formulas. Rituals and ceremonies played a crucial role in preserving legal memory. When a boundary was established or confirmed, the entire community might process along its length, with young boys being bumped or lightly beaten at key points. A physical memory aid, ensuring they would remember the boundary's location decades later. These beating the bounds ceremonies combined practical legal purpose with community bonding and the transmission of knowledge across generations. The flexibility of customary law was both its strength and its weakness. Because it wasn't written down, it could adapt to changing circumstances more easily than rigid statutory law. A custom that no longer served the community's needs could gradually be forgotten or modified through collective amnesia. But this same flexibility could also lead to uncertainty and manipulation. Powerful individuals might conveniently remember customs that favored their interests, while forgetting those that didn't. In St. Alekis, as in most medieval communities, certain customs achieved almost sacred status through their antiquity. The right to glean fallen grain after harvest, the obligation to maintain bridges and roads, the schedule of market days and fair times. These customs were so deeply embedded in community life that questioning them was almost unthinkable. They formed the unconscious substrate of daily existence, as natural and unquestioned as breathing. The interaction between different types of law created a rich and complex legal landscape. Royal law, emanating from the king's court, claimed superiority over all local customs, but in practice, royal justice was distant and expensive, available only for the most serious crimes or disputes involving significant property. For most people, most of the time, local custom remained the primary source of law. Merchant law added another layer of complexity. As trade routes expanded and commercial activity increased, merchants developed their own customs for resolving disputes quickly and fairly. These customs, known as the law merchant or lex mercatoria, operated alongside and sometimes in tension with local territorial law. In St. Aliquis's weekly market, disputes between merchants might be resolved according to commercial custom, even when local law would have produced a different result. The mental effort required to maintain this complex system of overlapping laws and customs was considerable. Legal authorities like Sire Eustace and Father Gregoire didn't just need good memories, they needed the ability to navigate between different legal traditions, finding points of harmony and resolving conflicts. They were, in essence, living computers, processing vast amounts of stored data to produce judgments that would be accepted as legitimate by the community. As we contemplate this world of unwritten law, we might reflect on how different it was from our own legal system, yet how similar in its fundamental purposes. Then, as now, law sought to provide predictability, resolve conflicts, and maintain social order. The methods were different: memory rather than writing, tradition rather than legislation, community consensus rather than professional expertise. But the human needs addressed were remarkably constant. The customary law of places like St. Aliquis represents one of humanity's great achievements: the creation of complex, functional legal systems without the aid of writing. These systems maintained order, transmitted values, and adapted to changing circumstances for centuries. They remind us that law, at its heart, is not about books or courtrooms, but about human communities finding ways to live together in relative peace and predictability. As we drift deeper into our exploration, imagine the voices of countless elders reciting the customs of their forebears, each generation adding its own layer of interpretation and adaptation. Picture the solemn faces of witnesses swearing to their memories of ancient boundaries and half-forgotten agreements. Feel the weight of tradition pressing down upon every legal decision, making innovation difficult, but stability almost assured. This was the world of customary law, a world where the past lived in the present through the medium of human memory, and where justice was quite literally a living tradition. Section 3. The Hierarchies of Judicial Power. As we continue our unhurried journey through the medieval legal landscape, we arrive at one of its most distinctive features: the division of judicial authority into high and low justice. This distinction, foreign to modern legal systems with their unified court structures, reveals much about how medieval society understood power, authority, and the very nature of law itself. Let us explore this concept slowly and thoroughly, allowing its complexities to unfold like a map of an unfamiliar country. Picture, if you will, a vast patchwork quilt spread across the countryside of medieval France. Each patch represents a different lordship, some large, some small, each with its own particular shade of judicial authority. This quilt has no uniform pattern. Here a duke's lands stretch wide with the deepest crimson of high justice. There a minor knight's holding shows only the pale pink of the most limited judicial rights. This visual metaphor helps us understand how justice in the medieval world was not a single, unified system, but rather a complex mosaic of overlapping and sometimes competing jurisdictions. Baron Conan of St. Aliquis, as we have established, possessed the right of high justice, in Latin, the merum imperium, or pure command. This was no small privilege. To hold high justice meant to wield the power of life and death over one's subjects, to sit in judgment over the most serious crimes, and to display the ultimate symbols of judicial authority. But what exactly did this mean in practical terms? Let us delve into the details with the careful attention they deserve. The right of high justice encompassed what we might call capital crimes, those offenses deemed so serious that they could result in the death penalty. Murder, of course, headed this list, but the category was far broader than modern definitions might suggest. Highway robbery, rape, arson, counterfeiting, and various forms of treason all fell under the umbrella of high justice. Even certain property crimes, if they involved sufficient value or were committed by repeat offenders, might warrant capital punishment. Consider the physical symbols of high justice that would have dominated the landscape around St. Aliquis. The gibbet or gallows, standing on a prominent hill where all could see it, served as a constant reminder of Baron Conan's ultimate authority. These structures were not hidden away, as modern executions might be, but rather displayed prominently as symbols of power and warnings to potential wrongdoers. The right to erect a gallows was itself a carefully guarded privilege. Only lords with high justice could maintain these grim monuments to their authority. The gallows of St. Aliquis, like those throughout medieval Europe, were built to last. Constructed of massive oak beams, they could accommodate multiple executions simultaneously. The number of pillars in a gallows even served as a status symbol. A duke might have a gallows with 6 or 8 pillars, while a baron like Conan would typically have 4. These structures stood permanently in place, their empty nooses swaying in the wind, a constant presence in the visual landscape of medieval life. But high justice involved more than just the power to execute. It included the authority to investigate serious crimes, using methods that would be forbidden to lesser lords. Baron Conan could order the use of judicial torture to extract confessions. He could command the services of professional executioners and torturers. He could imprison suspects for extended periods while investigations proceeded. He could confiscate the property of convicted felons, adding their goods to his own treasury. Each of these powers represented a significant expansion of authority beyond what lords with mere low justice could exercise. Now let us turn our attention to low justice, the mixtum imperium, or mixed command. This lesser form of judicial authority was far more common, held by countless minor lords, abbey leaders, and even some wealthy merchants who had purchased judicial rights. Low justice dealt with what we might call misdemeanors and civil disputes, the everyday conflicts and minor crimes that made up the bulk of medieval legal business. A lord possessing only low justice could impose fines, order floggings, command brief periods in the stocks or pillory, and adjudicate property disputes below a certain value. He could not, however, order executions, use judicial torture, or deal with crimes involving the shedding of blood. When such serious matters arose in his jurisdiction, he was obligated to transfer the case to a higher authority, typically the regional lord who held high justice. Imagine a small manor held by Sir Guillaume, a knight who owes service to Baron Conal. Sir Guillaume possesses low justice over his few dozen peasant families. When Pierre the ploughman accuses Jacques the miller of giving short weight, Sir Guillaume can hear the case and impose a fine. When Marie brings a complaint that her neighbor's pigs have destroyed her vegetable garden, the knight can order compensation. But when a traveling merchant is found murdered on the manor's lands, Sir Guillaume must immediately send word to Baron Conal, for this matter exceeds his judicial authority. The boundaries between high and low justice were not always clear, leading to frequent disputes between lords over jurisdiction. These conflicts might simmer for generations, erupting periodically into legal battles that could be as fierce as any military campaign. The archives of the period are full of cases where lords accused each other of exceeding their judicial authority or encroaching on ancient privileges. Consider the case of the Abbey of St. Benedict, located within Baron Conan's larger territory. The abbey claimed low justice over its lands by ancient grant, but the exact boundaries of those lands were disputed. When a crime occurred in the borderlands between abbey and baronial territory, both authorities might claim jurisdiction. Such disputes could escalate to the royal courts, involving years of litigation and substantial expense. The complexity deepened when we consider the various exemptions and special jurisdictions that dotted the medieval legal landscape. The Church claimed exclusive jurisdiction over its clergy. A priest accused of murder could not be tried in Baron Conan's court, but must be handed over to ecclesiastical authorities. Universities held similar privileges for their students and masters. Certain towns had purchased charters, granting them self-governance and their own courts. Foreign merchants might travel under safe conducts that exempted them from local justice. These overlapping jurisdictions created a legal maze that required considerable expertise to navigate. A crime might involve multiple parties with different legal statuses occurring in a location where several authorities claimed jurisdiction. Sorting out who had the right to try the case could take longer than the actual trial itself. The financial aspects of high and low justice deserve careful consideration. Judicial rights were not merely about power and authority, they were also significant sources of revenue. Every fine imposed, every property confiscated, every court fee collected, added to the Lord's coffers. High justice, with its ability to confiscate the property of executed felons, could be particularly lucrative. This economic dimension meant that judicial rights were carefully guarded and frequently disputed. Baron Conan's high justice brought responsibilities as well as privileges. He was expected to maintain the infrastructure of justice, the courthouse, the prison, the execution grounds. He had to pay the salaries of judicial officials like the bailiff, the jailer, and the executioner. He was responsible for pursuing dangerous criminals who fled his lands, sometimes at considerable expense. The exercise of high justice, while profitable, was not without its costs. The psychological impact of these different levels of justice on the medieval mind was profound. Knowing whether one lived under high or low justice affected daily behavior and long-term planning. Peasants under high justice might be more cautious, knowing that their lord's power extended to life and death. Those under low justice might feel somewhat more secure, knowing that the worst they faced for most offenses was a fine or a flogging. The gradual evolution of these jurisdictional divisions tells us much about the development of medieval society. In the early Middle Ages, Judicial authority was even more fragmented, with every petty lord claiming some degree of legal power. Over time, kings and great nobles worked to consolidate and rationalize the system, reducing the number of authorities, claiming high justice, and establishing clearer hierarchical relationships. By Baron Conan's time, the system had achieved a certain stability, though it remained complex. The king claimed ultimate judicial authority, delegating high justice to his great vassals. These in turn might grant low justice to their own vassals. The church maintained its parallel system of courts. Towns and guilds carved out their own judicial niches. The result was not a pyramid of authority, but rather a complex web of overlapping and sometimes conflicting jurisdictions. As we contemplate this intricate system, we might reflect on how different it was from modern unified court systems, yet how it served similar functions. It provided forums for resolving disputes, mechanisms for punishing crimes, and symbols of authority that reinforced social order. Its complexity reflected the complexity of medieval society itself, a world where multiple sources of authority coexisted, competed, and somehow managed to maintain a functional, if complicated, system of justice. The distinction between high and low justice would eventually fade as nation-states consolidated power and established uniform legal systems. But for centuries, it provided the framework within which medieval people understood law, authority, and their place in the social order. In St. Aliquis, Baron Conan's gallows on the hill stood as a visible reminder of this system, a symbol of ultimate authority that cast its shadow, both literally and figuratively, over all who lived within his lands. Section 4. Court Settings and Rituals of Judgment. Let us now immerse ourselves fully in the sensory experience of a medieval court session, moving beyond abstract concepts to explore the physical spaces, ritual procedures, and human dramas that gave life to the law in places like St. Aliquis. Justice in the medieval world was not conducted in austere courtrooms with formal procedures, but rather in a variety of settings that reflected the personal, public, and often theatrical nature of legal proceedings. Picture a spring morning in St. Aliquis, perhaps in the year of our Lord, 1285. The cock has crowed thrice, and the morning mist still clings to the lower slopes of the valley. In the bailey of Baron Conan's castle, preparations are underway for the monthly court session. Servants have swept the packed earth clean of the worst debris. A wooden platform has been erected against the inner wall of the courtyard, just high enough to raise the Baron above the crowd, but not so high as to seem distant or unapproachable. Upon this platform, they have placed the Baron's chair of justice, not a throne, for that would exceed his station, but a substantial wooden chair, with carved arms and a high back. The chair is old, its wood darkened with age, and polished by the touch of many hands. Legend says it was carved from an oak tree, under which Baron Conan's great-grandfather dispensed justice. Though whether this is true, or merely a story told to add gravitas to the proceedings, none can say for certain. The choice of an outdoor setting is not accidental. Medieval justice was public justice, conducted in the open where all could see and hear. This served multiple purposes. It prevented the kind of secret proceedings that might breed suspicion and resentment. It allowed the community to witness the law in action, learning from the cases of others. And it reinforced the theatrical nature of justice, transforming legal proceedings into a kind of morality play performed for the education and entertainment of the populace. As the morning progresses, the courtyard begins to fill. Peasants drift in from the surrounding villages, some leading disputes by the hand, others merely curious about the day's proceedings. They arrange themselves according to unspoken rules of precedence. The more substantial villagers, those who hold larger plots or practice respected trades, position themselves closer to the platform. The poorest huddle near the gates, ready to flee if their presence should prove unwelcome. The sensory atmosphere of these gatherings was rich and complex. The smell of unwashed bodies mingles with the scent of horses from the nearby stables. Chickens peck at the ground between people's feet, occasionally squawking when stepped upon. Dogs circle the crowd, hoping for scraps or attention. The sound of multiple conversations in the local dialect creates a low rumble, punctuated by occasional laughter or angry exclamations. Now Baron Conan emerges from the keep, preceded by his seneschal, Sire Eustace, who carries a white staff of office. The Baron wears his formal robes, not the full regalia he might don for a visit from the Duke, but garments that nonetheless set him apart from the common folk. Deep blue wool, trimmed with fur, catches the morning light. A gold chain of office rests upon his chest. His bearing is solemn, befitting the gravity of his duty. Behind the Baron comes Father Gregoire, carrying a precious gospel book and a small reliquary containing the finger bone of Saint Alicis himself. The presence of these sacred objects transforms the mundane courtyard into a sacred space where oaths will be sworn and divine justice invoked. 2 knights of the Baron's household follow, their mail shirts catching the sun, their hands resting casually but meaningfully on their sword hilts, a reminder that the Baron's justice is backed by force when necessary. The court session begins with ritual. Father Gregoire intones a prayer in Latin, calling upon God to guide the proceedings and inspire true justice. Most of the crowd understands not a word, but they bow their heads and cross themselves at the appropriate moments. The familiar cadence of the Church's language provides comfort and legitimacy to what follows. Sire Eustace then calls the court to order, his voice carrying across the courtyard. With the practice of decades, he recites the traditional opening formula, warning all present that they stand in a court of justice, where lies will be punished and truth rewarded. He reminds them of the Baron's authority, derived from the king and ultimately from God. He calls upon any who have grievances to step forward and present them in good order. The first case is a simple matter of debt. Picture Jean the carpenter, a man of middle years with hands scarred by years of working with wood. He steps forward, cap in hand, and bows deeply to the Baron. His voice trembles slightly as he begins his complaint against Thomas the Thatcher, who owes him 3 silver pennies for repairs to his workshop roof. The debt is 6 months overdue, and Jean's repeated requests for payment have been ignored. Thomas is called forward. He too bows, though perhaps not quite as deeply as Jean. His excuse is rambling and complex. A sick child, a poor harvest, promises of future payment. Baron Conan listens patiently, occasionally stroking his beard or exchanging quiet words with Sire Eustace. The crowd watches in silence, some nodding in sympathy with Jean, others clearly siding with Thomas. The resolution of such cases followed patterns refined over generations. Baron Conan might question both parties, seeking to understand not just the immediate dispute, but the broader context. Are these men known to each other? Have they had disputes before? What is their reputation in the community? Often, he would turn to the crowd, asking if any could speak to the character of the disputants or provide additional information. Witnesses might be called forward, Each would approach the gospel book held by Father Gregoire, place their hand upon it, and swear to tell the truth. The physical act of touching the holy book while speaking was believed to make lying not just perjury, but sacrilege. Many a witness had been known to suddenly remember things differently when faced with the prospect of swearing on Holy Writ. In this case, Baron Conan's judgment is swift and practical. Thomas must pay Jean 2 pennies immediately, and the third by the feast of St. Michael. If he fails, he will spend 3 days in the stocks. The judgment attempts to balance justice with mercy, acknowledging Jean's rightful claim, while recognizing Thomas's difficult circumstances. Both men bow, accepting the judgment, and the next case is called. As the morning progresses, the cases become more complex. A dispute over grazing rights requires extensive testimony about traditional boundaries and seasonal patterns. Baron Conan calls upon Sire Eustace's memory of similar cases, and the old seneschal recites precedents going back decades. The crowd listens attentively, for many of them have their own animals and their own concerns about grazing rights. The most dramatic cases are saved for last, when the crowd is largest and attention most focused. A young woman named Margot accuses the miller's son of assault. The courtyard falls silent as she tells her story, her voice barely above a whisper. The accused stands defiant, denying everything. This is no simple matter of debt or property, but a crime that touches on honor, violence, and the fundamental safety of the community. For such serious matters, different procedures come into play. Baron Conan might order a compurgation, requiring the accused to find a certain number of oath helpers willing to swear to his innocence. The number required depends on the severity of the charge and the status of the accused. These oath helpers are not witnesses to the alleged crime. Rather, they stake their own reputations on their belief in the accused's character. Alternatively, if the evidence is ambiguous and the stakes high enough, Baron Conan might order trial by ordeal. The accused would be given a choice: carry a red-hot iron, plunge his hand into boiling water, or face his accuser in judicial combat. The theory, deeply rooted in medieval theology, held that God would intervene to protect the innocent. The practical effect was often to encourage last-minute settlements or confessions. The physical arrangement of the court reinforced social hierarchies while allowing for community participation. Baron Conan, elevated on his platform, literally looked down upon the proceedings. The clergy stood to his right, the traditional place of honor. His knights flanked him, ready to enforce order, if needed. The disputants stood in the center, exposed to the gaze of all. The crowd formed a living amphitheater, their faces a sea of judgment that could be as harsh as any formal sentence. Between cases, the atmosphere would shift. Vendors might circulate through the crowd, selling ale or bread. Children would play at the edges of the gathering. Gossip would flow as freely as the weak beer, with the morning's cases providing fodder for weeks of village conversation. The court day was as much social event as legal proceeding, one of the few occasions when the entire community gathered in one place. The duration of court sessions varied enormously. Simple cases might be resolved in minutes, while complex disputes could stretch across multiple sessions. Baron Conan had to balance the need for thorough justice with the practical constraints of time and attention. As the sun climbed higher and the morning coolness gave way to midday heat, both judge and judged would grow weary. Some cases required immediate execution of sentence. A man found guilty of theft might be taken directly to the pillory and locked in place. there to endure the jeers and thrown refuse of his neighbors. A woman convicted of gossiping might have a scold's bridle placed upon her head, the iron bit preventing her from speaking. These immediate punishments served as vivid demonstrations of justice, impressing upon all. Section 5. Trial by combat and the logic of ordeals. As we delve deeper into the medieval justice system, we encounter one of its most dramatic, and to modern sensibilities, most alien features: the appeal to divine intervention through trial by combat and ordeal. These practices, which place the determination of guilt or innocence in God's hands, rather than human judgment, reveal fundamental assumptions about the nature of truth, justice, and the divine order that permeated medieval society. Let us explore these practices with the careful attention they deserve, understanding them not as primitive superstitions but as logical extensions of a worldview that saw God's hand in every aspect of human affairs. The theological foundation for trial by ordeal rested on a simple but powerful premise. God, being omniscient and just, would not allow an innocent person to suffer unjustly. If human wisdom proved insufficient to determine the truth of a matter, then divine wisdom could be invoked through ritual tests. This was not seen as tempting God, but rather as accepting his standing offer to guide human justice when earthly means failed. Consider the mindset that made such practices not only acceptable, but necessary. In a world without forensic science, without professional police forces, without the investigative tools we take for granted, determining the truth in disputed matters often came down to one person's word against another's. When both parties swore sacred oaths, when witnesses contradicted each other, when physical evidence was absent or ambiguous, what recourse remained but to appeal to a higher power? Trial by combat represented the most dramatic form of divine judgment, typically reserved for the nobility and for the most serious accusations. Picture, if you will, the preparation for such a trial in St. Aliquis. The accused, let us say a knight named Sir Rowland, has been charged with treason, secretly corresponding with Baron Conan's enemies. Sir Rowland vehemently denies the charge and, as is his right as a nobleman, demands trial by combat to prove his innocence. The preparations for judicial combat were elaborate and deeply ritualized. First, a suitable champion must be found for the accusation. In this case, Sir Gautier, a cousin of the man who brought the charge, agrees to serve as champion. Both men are of similar age and skill, ensuring that the combat will be a true test of divine favor, rather than a mere mismatch of abilities. The night before the combat, both participants undergo spiritual preparation. They fast, pray, and make confession to their respective priests. The logic is clear. They are about to place their lives in God's hands, and must therefore be in a state of grace. Sir Rowland spends the night in the castle chapel, kneeling before the altar, his armor piled beside him, like the shed skin of some metallic serpent. His prayers are fervent, mixing protestations of innocence with pleas for divine assistance. The morning of the combat dawns clear and cold. A level field has been prepared outside the castle walls, marked out with ropes and stakes. Viewing stands have been erected for the nobility, while commoners crowd around the perimeter, standing on carts or climbing trees for a better view. This is more than entertainment. It is divine justice made visible, a direct communication between heaven and earth. The rituals preceding the combat are extensive. Both combatants swear solemn oaths on holy relics, declaring the justice of their cause. Sir Rowland places his hand on the reliquary of St. Aliquis and swears that he is innocent of treason that he has never conspired against his Lord, and that he submits to God's judgment in the coming trial. Sir Gautier swears with equal fervor that the accusation is true, and that God will grant him victory in the righteous cause. Father Gregoire blesses both combatants, sprinkling them with holy water and reciting prayers that call upon God to reveal the truth through the outcome of the combat. The weapons are also blessed, typically sword and shield for such a serious matter, though the exact arms might vary based on the status of the combatants and the nature of the accusation. Baron Conan, presiding over the trial, makes a final offer of reconciliation. Even at this late moment, the parties can choose to settle the matter peacefully, but with honor at stake and positions hardened, neither Sir Roland nor his accusers are willing to back down. The Baron signals for the combat to begin. The actual combat is brief but intense. The two knights circle each other warily, testing each other's defenses with tentative thrusts. The crowd watches in near silence, understanding that they are witnessing not just a fight, but a divine revelation. Every successful parry by Sir Roland is seen as evidence of his innocence. Every stumble suggests guilt. The psychological pressure on the combatants is immense. They fight not just for their lives, but for their eternal souls. After several minutes of inconclusive swordplay, Sir Gautier manages to land a telling blow, his sword finding a gap in Sir Roland's armor and drawing blood. Sir Roland staggers but doesn't fall. He rallies, fighting with desperate energy, and manages to wound Sir Gautier in return. Both men are now bleeding, their strength flagging. The outcome hangs in balance. Finally, in a moment that seems to stretch into eternity, Sir Roland's sword breaks against Sir Gautier's shield. Defenseless, he falls to his knees, acknowledging defeat. The crowd erupts in mixed reactions. Some see God's judgment clearly revealed. Others mutter about bad luck or poor weapon quality. But the legal outcome is clear. Sir Roland has been proven guilty by divine judgment. The aftermath of judicial combat could vary. In this case, having been proven a traitor, Sir Roland faces execution. But the fact that he fought bravely and submitted to God's judgment might earn him a nobleman's death by beheading rather than the hanging, reserved for common criminals. His lands will be forfeit, his family dishonored, but at least he faced his fate with courage. Not all trials by combat ended in death. For lesser offenses, the combat might continue only until one party was clearly defeated or withdrew. For disputes over property or honor, rather than criminal charges, the loser might simply have to pay compensation and acknowledge the justice of the winner's cause. The flexibility of the system allowed it to address a wide range of conflicts while maintaining the central premise of divine judgment. The practice of judicial combat was not without its critics, even in medieval times. Some theologians argued that it was wrong to expect God to intervene in human disputes, that it was a form of tempting divine providence. Practical minds noted that the system favored the strong and skilled over the weak and clumsy, regardless of the justice of their cause. But such criticisms were generally overruled by the weight of tradition and the lack of better alternatives. For those unable or unwilling to engage in combat, women, clergy, the elderly, the infirm, other forms of ordeal were available. These too relied on divine intervention, but through different mechanisms. The ordeal of hot iron was among the most common. The accused would be required to carry a heated iron bar for a specified distance, usually 9 steps. The hand would then be bound and sealed. After 3 days, the bandages would be removed. If the wound showed signs of healing cleanly, innocence was proven. If it festered or showed signs of infection, guilt was assumed. Picture young Margot, the woman who accused the miller's son of assault. Unable to prove her case through witnesses, she might be offered the ordeal of hot iron to establish the truth of her claim. The entire village would gather to witness the trial. The iron would be heated in a forge until it glowed red, then blessed by Father Gregoire. Margot would be given a final chance to withdraw her accusation, knowing that a false claim would result not just in a burned hand, but in divine punishment. The psychological impact of these ordeals cannot be overstated. Many accused persons, faced with the imminent prospect of divine judgment, would confess rather than undergo the trial. Others, sustained by genuine belief in their innocence or by desperate courage, would submit to the ordeal, and sometimes emerge vindicated. The system worked, in its way, as much through fear and faith as through any supernatural intervention. The ordeal of cold water presented a particularly paradoxical form of divine judgment. The accused would be bound and thrown into a body of water that had been blessed by a priest. If they sank, they were innocent, the pure water accepting them. If they floated, they were guilty, the holy water rejecting their sin. The obvious problem with this ordeal was that the innocent party might drown before being pulled out. Though in practice, ropes were usually attached to prevent this unfortunate outcome. The gradual decline of trial by ordeal provides a fascinating glimpse into changing medieval mentalities. In 1215, the Fourth Lateran Council prohibited clergy from participating in ordeals, effectively removing the religious sanction that made them legitimate. This decision reflected growing theological sophistication and perhaps a recognition that divine justice need not be so directly invoked in human affairs. The prohibition created a crisis in legal proceedings across Europe. Without ordeals, how could difficult cases be resolved? The answer came in the form of increased reliance on jury trials, more sophisticated investigation procedures, and the gradual development of legal principles that would eventually evolve into modern jurisprudence. But this transition took centuries, and in places like Saint-Alicuis, the memory and occasional practice of ordeals lingered long after official prohibition. The logic of ordeals extended beyond formal legal proceedings into everyday life. People might invoke informal ordeals to settle disputes or prove their honesty. A merchant accused of cheating might offer to grasp a hot coin to prove his innocence. A woman suspected of adultery might volunteer to walk barefoot over hot plowshares. These informal ordeals, while lacking official sanction, drew on the same deep belief in divine justice that underlay the formal system. As we contemplate these practices from our modern perspective, it's easy to see them as cruel and irrational. But within their own context, they served important functions. They provided closure in cases where truth seemed unknowable. They reinforced the belief that justice ultimately came from God, not man. They offered a form of psychological resolution for communities torn by accusation and counter-accusation. And they reminded all involved that earthly justice was but a pale reflection of divine judgment. The theatrical nature of ordeals also served social functions. Like public executions, they provided communal catharsis and reinforcement of shared values. They demonstrated the power of the authorities who administered them and the church that blessed them. They created memorable events that would be discussed and debated for years, becoming part of the collective memory that shaped future behavior. In St. Alekis, the site of ordeals would have been carefully chosen for maximum impact. The ordeal of hot iron might take place in the church itself, emphasizing its sacred nature. Trial by combat would occur in a field visible from the castle walls, allowing Baron Conan to preside from a position of authority. The ordeal of water might use the mill pond, a central location familiar to all villagers. These choices of venue reinforced the connection between divine judgment and earthly authority. The equipment used in ordeals became objects of fearsome reputation. The iron bars used in hot iron ordeals would be kept in the church, visible reminders of divine justice. The scales used to weigh accused witches against Bibles would hang in the market square. The ropes used in water ordeals would be blessed and carefully maintained. These objects took on almost talismanic qualities, embodying the awesome power of divine judgment. As we continue our journey through medieval justice, the practice of trial by ordeal stands as perhaps the clearest example of how different the medieval worldview was from our own. Yet, in its own terms, it was logical, consistent, and deeply meaningful. It addressed real problems of proof and judgment in a world without modern investigative tools. It reinforced core beliefs about divine providence and human sinfulness, and it provided a form of resolution that, however harsh, was accepted as legitimate by the vast majority of society. The echoes of this system can still be heard in our modern legal language. We still speak of trials, suggesting an ordeal or test. We still require witnesses to swear oaths, invoking a higher power to guarantee truthfulness. We still seek ultimate justice, even if we no longer expect it to be revealed through burning iron or blessed water. In this way, the medieval system of ordeals, for all its apparent strangeness, connects to enduring human desires for truth, justice, and divine order in human affairs. Section 6. Torture and Confession. Now we must descend into one of the darkest aspects of medieval justice, the systematic use of torture to extract confessions. This is not a pleasant subject, but it is essential to understanding how justice operated in places like St. Alekis. We shall examine this practice with the same careful, methodical attention we have given to other aspects of medieval law, neither sensationalizing nor minimizing its reality. Let us proceed slowly, understanding torture not as mindless cruelty, but as a regulated judicial procedure with its own logic, limitations, and justifications. The medieval understanding of torture differed fundamentally from modern conceptions. It was not primarily a form of punishment that came later after guilt was established. Rather, torture was an investigative tool, a means of arriving at truth when other methods failed. The technical term was quaestio, meaning question or inquiry, revealing its supposed purpose, to question the body when the mind refused to cooperate. Picture the legal mindset that made torture seem not just acceptable, but necessary. In a system that placed enormous weight on confession, seen as the queen of proofs, what happened when a suspect refused to confess despite strong circumstantial evidence? Without modern forensic techniques, without sophisticated investigative procedures, confession often seemed the only way to achieve certainty in criminal cases. Torture, in this view, was simply a tool to overcome the obstinacy of guilty parties who refused to acknowledge their crimes. The practice was hedged about with regulations and restrictions, at least in theory. Not everyone could be tortured. Nobles were generally exempt, their honor presumed to make them more susceptible to other forms of pressure. Clergy could not be tortured by secular authorities, falling instead under church jurisdiction. Pregnant women, children under a certain age, usually 14, and the elderly were also typically exempt. These exemptions reflected both practical concerns: a dead suspect could not confess, and social hierarchies that granted different levels of bodily integrity to different classes of people. Let us descend now into the lower chambers of Baron Conan's castle, where the instruments of judicial torture were kept. The approach to these chambers was deliberately intimidating. Narrow stone stairs spiraled downward, lit only by flickering torches. The air grew cooler and damper with each step. The sounds of the castle above, the bustle of servants, the laughter of knights, the barking of dogs, faded away, replaced by an oppressive silence broken only by the drip of water and the scurrying of rats. The torture chamber itself was a study in calculated intimidation. The room was low-ceilinged and windowless, lit by torches that cast dancing shadows on the stone walls. Various instruments hung from hooks and rested on rough wooden tables, each designed for a specific purpose. The very sight of these devices was often enough to loosen tongues, their mere presence serving as a form of psychological pressure that preceded any physical application. At the center of this grim theater stood Maître Denis, the executioner and torturer of Saint-Aliquis. Let us consider this man more carefully, for he embodies one of the great paradoxes of medieval society. Maître Denis was both necessary and reviled, professional and pariah. His yellow robe marked him as set apart from normal society, yet his skills were essential to the functioning of justice. He had likely inherited his position from his father, as was common in this profession, learning from childhood the precise application of pain that would extract confession without causing death. The tools of Maître Denis' trade were numerous and varied, each with its own particular use and level of severity. The thumbscrew, a device of deceptive simplicity, consisted of metal plates that could be tightened around the thumbs or fingers by means of a screw mechanism. The pressure could be gradually increased, allowing for precise control over the level of pain inflicted. This made it particularly suitable for questioning, as the torturer could increase or decrease pressure in response to the suspect's cooperation. The strappado represented a more severe form of torture. The accused would have their hands tied behind their back, then be hoisted by a rope attached to their wrists. The weight of the body hanging from the reversed shoulders caused excruciating pain and often resulted in dislocation. Weights might be attached to the feet to increase the strain. The beauty of this method, from the torturer's perspective, was that it left no visible marks if done carefully, allowing authorities to claim that no excessive force had been used. Consider the case of one Guillaume the poacher, caught with the Baron's deer in his possession. The penalty for poaching was severe, potentially death, but Guillaume stubbornly maintained his innocence, claiming he had found the deer already dead. With no witnesses, and Guillaume refusing to confess, Baron Conan authorized the use of judicial torture to extract the truth. The process began not with physical pain, but with psychological pressure. Guillaume would be brought to the torture chamber and shown the instruments. Maître Denis would explain, in his soft, matter-of-fact voice, exactly what each device did and how it would be applied. He might demonstrate the thumbscrew on a piece of wood, showing how it could crack and splinter under pressure. This preliminary phase, known as the territio, was often sufficient to produce confessions. But Guillaume, whether from innocence or extraordinary courage, continued to maintain his story. The next phase began with the mildest forms of torture. His thumbs would be placed in the screws and gradually tightened. The pain would build slowly, from discomfort to agony. Between each turn of the screw, he would be asked again, "Did you kill the Baron's deer?" Each denial would result in another turn. The sessions were carefully regulated, at least in theory. A notary would be present to record any statements made. Baron Conan or his representative would oversee the proceedings to ensure they didn't exceed legal bounds. Excessive torture, that resulted in death or permanent maiming, could bring criticism and even legal consequences for overzealous authorities. The goal was confession, not destruction. The psychological dynamics of the torture chamber were complex. The torturer needed to maintain a delicate balance, applying enough pain to overcome resistance, but not so much as to render the victim insensible or desperate enough to say anything. Experienced torturers like Maître Denis developed an almost intuitive sense for when a suspect was approaching their breaking point. Water torture represented another common method. The accused would be bound to a table, their head lower than their feet. A cloth would be placed over their face, and water slowly poured over it. The sensation of drowning, combined with the actual difficulty of breathing, created panic that often led to confession. This method had the advantage of being easily controlled and leaving no permanent marks. The boots, or brodequins, were reserved for more serious cases. The victim's legs would be placed between boards that could be tightened with wedges. As the wedges were hammered in, the pressure on the legs increased, potentially crushing bones. This method was particularly feared because it could leave permanent disability, making it a last resort, even in an age not known for squeamishness about physical punishment. The question of false confessions was recognized even in medieval times. Theologians and legal scholars debated whether confessions extracted under torture were reliable. Some argued that the innocent would be sustained by God and able to withstand any torment. Others, more practical, noted that people would say anything to stop the pain. This led to the requirement that confessions made under torture be verified by repetition, without torture, though the threat of renewed torture made such verification problematic. In Guillaume's case, after hours of steadily increasing pressure, he finally broke. Yes, he confessed, he had killed the deer. He had been hungry, his family starving, and the temptation had been too great. The confession was duly recorded by the notary. Guillaume was returned to his cell to await formal sentencing. But the story doesn't end there. The next day, Guillaume would be brought before Baron Conan again. Without the immediate pressure of torture, would he maintain his confession? If he recanted, claiming the confession was forced, he could be returned to torture as a varying witness. This created a terrible dilemma: maintain a possibly false confession and face certain punishment, or recant and face renewed torture. The use of torture extended beyond criminal cases to matters of heresy and witchcraft. The Church, despite some theological reservations, authorized the use of torture in cases of suspected heresy. The infamous papal bull Ad Extirpanda of 1252 permitted inquisitors to use torture, though it technically prohibited bloodshed, mutilation, or death. This led to creative interpretations, torture methods that caused internal damage without breaking the skin were deemed acceptable. The psychological impact of living in a society where judicial torture was accepted, practice, cannot be underestimated. The knowledge that confession could be compelled through pain affected how people behaved, what they said, and whom they trusted. It created a climate of fear that extended far beyond those actually subjected to torture. Every person accused of a crime knew that resistance might lead to the torture chamber, encouraging quick confessions whether guilty or innocent. The role of medical knowledge in torture deserves consideration. Torturers often possessed crude but effective understanding of human anatomy and pain response. They knew which areas of the body were most sensitive, how much pressure various organs could withstand, and how to revive someone who had fainted from pain. This medical knowledge was passed down through generations of torturers, creating a grim body of practical expertise. The presence of a physician during torture sessions, which became more common in later medieval periods, added another layer of complexity. The physician's role was ostensibly to prevent death, but in practice, they often simply enabled more prolonged and severe torture by advising when to pause or change methods. This medical involvement lent a veneer of scientific rationality to what remained fundamentally a brutal practice. The economics of torture also merit attention. Maintaining a torture chamber, employing a skilled torturer, and conducting formal torture sessions required resources. This meant that torture was more commonly used in serious cases where significant punishment, and therefore significant fines or confiscations, might result. Petty criminals might escape torture simply because the potential profit didn't justify the expense. The spiritual dimensions of torture created particular anguish for the faithful. Many believed that dying under torture, without confessing, would result in damnation, as it implied dying in a state of unrepented sin. This created enormous pressure to confess, even falsely, to ensure one's salvation. Priests might be brought to the torture chamber to offer spiritual counsel, adding religious pressure to the physical and psychological torment. The gradual decline of judicial torture, which began in the later Middle Ages and accelerated during the Renaissance, reflected changing ideas about evidence, human dignity, and the nature of truth. Legal scholars began to develop alternative methods of proof that relied less on confession. The growth of professional legal systems created judges and lawyers who were skeptical of torture's reliability. Humanitarian concerns, while not absent in the medieval period, gained more prominent voice. But in Baron Conan's time, torture remained an accepted and regulated part of the judicial system. It was not random cruelty, but institutionalized violence, embedded in legal procedures and theological justifications. Those who administered it were not sadists, but professionals, performing a necessary, if distasteful, duty. Those who suffered it were caught in a system that valued certainty over mercy, confession over protestation of innocence. As we contemplate this dark chapter of medieval justice, we might reflect on how the desire for certainty in criminal justice can lead to terrible means. The medieval authorities who authorized torture were not monsters, but men trying to maintain order and punish crime with the tools available to them. Their failure was not one of intention, but of imagination, the inability to conceive of a justice system that could function without the systematic infliction of pain. The torture chamber of St. Aliquis, with its careful procedures and regulated violence, stands as a reminder of how institutional cruelty can be normalized and justified. It shows us how ordinary people can participate in extraordinary brutality when it is sanctioned by authority and tradition, and it demonstrates the importance of legal protections and procedural safeguards that later centuries would develop to prevent such abuses. As we prepare to move on from this grim subject, let us remember Guillaume the poacher. Whether guilty or innocent, broken by pain into confession. Let us remember Maître Denis, professional in his application of agony. Let us remember Baron Conan, authorizing torture in the name of justice, and let us be grateful for the slow, imperfect, but real progress that has made such scenes relics of history rather than contemporary reality. Section 7. The Executioner's Office and Social Standing. Having explored the dark realm of judicial torture, we now turn to examine more closely the figure who embodied the ultimate authority of medieval justice, the executioner. In our narrative of Saint Alexis, this role is filled by Maître Denis, a man whose very existence illuminated the complex contradictions of medieval society. Through understanding his position, duties, and social standing, we gain insight into how medieval communities dealt with the necessary but disturbing realities of capital punishment and corporal justice. The office of executioner in medieval society presents us with a fascinating paradox. Here was a man whose services were absolutely essential to the maintenance of law and order, yet who was simultaneously shunned and marginalized by the very society he served. This contradiction went to the heart of medieval attitudes toward violence, death, and social pollution. Let us examine this paradox slowly and thoroughly, understanding how one man could be both indispensable and untouchable. Picture Maître Denis going about his daily life in Saint-Alexis. He lives in a house on the outskirts of the settlement, carefully positioned outside the town walls but within sight of the castle. This location is not accidental. It keeps him accessible when his services are needed, while maintaining the social distance that custom demands. His dwelling is substantial enough, for executioners were generally well compensated, but it stands apart from the clusters of homes where normal families live. The physical appearance of Maître Denis would have immediately marked him as different. The yellow robe was not merely a uniform, but a badge of separation, visible from a distance, warning others of his approach. In some regions, executioners were required to wear special badges or distinctive hats. These markers served the same function as a leper's bell. They allowed the clean members of society to avoid contamination through contact with one who regularly dealt in death. The path to becoming an executioner was rarely chosen freely. Most commonly, the profession was hereditary, passed from father to son like a cursed inheritance. Maître Denis likely learned his trade from his own father, beginning as a child, by maintaining the equipment and observing executions. This apprenticeship was both practical and psychological. The young boy had to learn not just the technical skills, but also the emotional detachment necessary for the work. Consider the skills that an effective executioner needed to possess. First and foremost was the ability to kill cleanly and efficiently. A bungled execution brought shame not just on the executioner, but on the entire system of justice. When beheading a nobleman, the executioner was expected to sever the head with a single stroke of the sword. This required strength, precision, and steady nerves. Hours of practice on animal carcasses would precede the first real execution, but the executioner's duties extended far beyond the moment of execution. Maître Denis served as the keeper of the dungeon, responsible for the prisoners awaiting trial or punishment. He had to ensure they remained alive and relatively healthy until their appointed time. This might involve basic medical care, as a prisoner who died of neglect before trial or execution represented a failure of justice. The executioner also administered non-lethal punishments, floggings, brandings, mutilations. Each of these required different skills. A flogging had to be severe enough to satisfy justice, but not so severe as to cause death. The executioner needed to know how many lashes a person could endure, based on their age, health, and constitution. He had to space the blows properly, allowing the full effect of each to be felt, without causing shock that might prematurely end the punishment. Branding required its own expertise. The iron had to be heated to exactly the right temperature, hot enough to leave a permanent mark but not so hot as to cause excessive damage. The executioner needed a steady hand to ensure the brand was clear and properly positioned. A poorly executed brand might heal illegibly, defeating its purpose as a permanent mark of shame. The social isolation of the executioner extended to his entire family. Maître Denis's wife, if he had one, would face her own form of ostracism. Other women would avoid her at the market. Her children would be excluded from games with other children. Marriages had to be arranged within the small community of other executioners' families, creating a hereditary caste of social outcasts. This isolation was rooted in deep-seated beliefs about spiritual and physical contamination. Blood, in medieval thought, carried special significance. One who regularly shed blood, even in the service of justice, was marked by that contact. The executioner was barred from many normal social activities. He could not serve as a witness in court, his testimony being considered tainted. He was often excluded from guilds and confraternities. In some places, he was forbidden from entering taverns or attending public festivals. The church's attitude toward executioners was particularly complex. On one hand, the church sanctioned capital punishment for serious crimes, citing biblical precedent. On the other hand, canon law prohibited clerics from shedding blood, and this prohibition extended a kind of spiritual suspicion to those who did so professionally. Executioners were generally allowed to attend Mass, but might be required to stand apart from the congregation, entering last and leaving first. Yet despite this marginalization, the executioner often accumulated considerable wealth. His fees were set by law and could be substantial. In addition to payment for executions, he received portions of the goods confiscated from executed criminals. He might have the right to claim the clothes of those he executed, a valuable perquisite in an age when fabric was expensive. Some executioners also served as knackers, disposing of dead animals, or as healers, their knowledge of anatomy giving them medical expertise. This wealth created another layer of social tension. Here was a man despised by society, yet often richer than many who despised him. Maître Denis might wear finer clothes than many merchants, live in a better house than many craftsmen, yet remain forever outside the bounds of respectable society. This economic success without social acceptance created a unique form of isolation. The executioner's relationship with those he executed was complex and often surprisingly intimate. In the days or hours before an execution, Maître Denis might spend considerable time with the condemned. He would check their chains, bring them food, perhaps even offer rough comfort. Some executioners developed reputations for kindness to the condemned, ensuring their last hours were as comfortable as possible. On the day of execution, the executioner played a ritualized role that went beyond mere killing. He would formally ask forgiveness of the condemned, a ceremony that acknowledged the moral complexity of his actions. The condemned would typically grant this forgiveness, understanding that the executioner was merely the instrument of justice, not its author. This exchange helped maintain the fiction that the execution was a judicial act, rather than a murder. The technical aspects of different execution methods required different skills. Hanging, the most common form of execution for commoners, might seem simple, but required considerable expertise. The executioner needed to position the knot correctly to ensure a quick death by breaking the neck, rather than slow strangulation. He had to judge the length of the drop based on the weight of the condemned. Too short a drop meant slow suffocation. Too long might decapitate the victim, turning the execution into an unintended spectacle. Beheading, reserved for nobles, required even greater skill. The executioner's sword was a specialized tool, heavier than a military sword, and designed for chopping rather than thrusting. Maître Denis would keep his sword carefully maintained, its edge sharp enough to cut through neck bones and tissue with a single blow. The night before a beheading, he might spend hours honing the blade, knowing that his reputation depended on a clean cut. Burning at the stake, used for heretics and witches, presented different challenges. The executioner had to build the pyre correctly, ensuring it would burn hot enough to kill relatively quickly. Sometimes, mercy was shown by strangling the condemned before lighting the fire, or by placing bags of gunpowder around their neck to hasten death. The executioner had to manage the crowd, which might try to throw additional fuel on the fire, or, conversely, attempt to rescue the condemned. The psychological toll of this work cannot be ignored. How did Maître Denis reconcile his profession with his humanity? Some executioners reportedly turned to drink, drowning their conscience in alcohol. Others developed elaborate justifications, seeing themselves as servants of divine justice. Still others seemed to develop a professional detachment, viewing their work simply as a necessary service, like butchering animals or cleaning streets. The executioner's role in maintaining public order extended beyond punishments. His very presence served as a deterrent. Children were warned to behave, or Maître Denis will come for you. His house was pointed out to visitors as a reminder of the consequences of crime. His yellow robe glimpsed in the market reminded everyone that justice had teeth. Yet there were moments when the executioner's humanity broke through the professional facade. Records tell of executioners who botched executions deliberately to allow last-minute reprieves. Some showed special kindness to condemned women or children. Others were known to pray for the souls of those they executed, maintaining private chapels where masses were said for the dead. The executioner also served as an unofficial historian of crime and punishment. Through his career, Maître Denis would accumulate vast experience of human nature at its extremes. He would witness final confessions, last-minute conversions, acts of courage and cowardice. This knowledge, passed down through generations of executioners, formed a kind of alternative history of medieval society, told from the scaffold rather than the throne. As we contemplate the figure of Maître Denis, we see embodied in one man the contradictions of medieval justice. He was the ultimate enforcer of law, yet stood outside legal protection. He maintained order, yet was seen as a source of disorder. He was wealthy, yet worthless, necessary, yet despised, powerful, yet powerless. His existence shows us how medieval society dealt with necessary evils by creating specialized roles that concentrated moral pollution in specific individuals, allowing the rest of society to benefit from their services while maintaining moral distance. The gradual improvement in the executioner's social status over the centuries tells us something about changing attitudes toward justice and social organization. As execution became less common and justice more institutionalized, The executioner evolved from pariah to civil servant. But in Baron Conan's time, Maître Denis remained what he had always been, a necessary monster, human enough to pity, but too tainted by his profession to embrace. The economics of imprisonment created additional hardships. Prisons were not funded by the state, but operated on a fee system. Prisoners were expected to pay for their own maintenance, food, straw, candles, even the chains that bound them. Those without resources faced starvation, unless they could beg food from other prisoners or charitable visitors. The prison keeper, usually working under Maître Denis, supplemented his income by selling easements, a lighter chain, a better cell, permission for visitors, extra food. This system created a hierarchy even within the misery of imprisonment. Wealthy prisoners might live in relative comfort, having food brought from outside, wine to drink, candles to pierce the darkness. They might even have servants imprisoned with them to attend to their needs. Poor prisoners survived on prison rations, typically bread and water, occasionally supplemented with thin gruel or spoiled vegetables rejected by the castle kitchen. The daily routine of dungeon life was monotonous in the extreme. Dawn was marked not by sunlight, but by the arrival of the guard with the daily ration. Prisoners would be counted. Deaths in the night were common and needed to be recorded. The dead would be dragged out, often by other prisoners in exchange for extra food. Their bodies would be buried in unconsecrated ground, another punishment extending beyond death. Days passed in enforced idleness. Prisoners might talk among themselves, sharing stories, planning defenses, or simply complaining. Gambling with improvised dice or cards helped pass time. Some prisoners, particularly those facing long waits for trial, might organize themselves into mock courts, trying each other's cases for entertainment. Religious prisoners might organize prayer groups, finding comfort in shared faith. The arrival of new prisoners provided momentary excitement. They would be questioned about events in the outside world, their crimes discussed and judged by the impromptu prison community. Fresh victims for extortion would be identified, new prisoners who might have hidden money or family resources that could be tapped. The prison community had its own rough justice, with violent criminals often dominating and extracting tribute from others. Disease was a constant companion in the dungeons. The combination of poor nutrition, filthy conditions, untreated wounds, and close quarters created ideal conditions for illness. Jail fever, probably typhus, regularly swept through prisons, killing prisoners and guards alike. Skin diseases, respiratory infections, and intestinal ailments were endemic. Medical care was non-existent unless a prisoner could pay for it, and even then, medieval medicine could offer little help in such conditions. The psychological effects of dungeon imprisonment were profound. The darkness, isolation, and uncertainty broke many prisoners before they ever faced a trial. Some went mad, their ravings adding to the general misery. Others retreated into themselves, becoming catatonic. Suicide, while difficult, given the chains and lack of privacy, was not unknown. Prisoners might refuse food, bash their heads against stone walls, or find ingenious ways to end their suffering. Yet human resilience also manifested in surprising ways. Prisoners formed friendships and alliances. They shared food with those who had none. They maintained what dignity they could, creating rules and customs that provided structure to their confined world. Some found religion in the darkness, experiencing spiritual transformations that sustained them through their ordeal. Others discovered inner strength they never knew they possessed. The role of visitors in prison life deserves consideration. Family members might be permitted to visit, bringing food, news, and emotional support. These visits were regulated and often required bribes to the guards. Charitable organizations, often run by religious orders, might provide food and spiritual comfort to prisoners. The arrival of such visitors broke the monotony and provided connection to the outside world. For women prisoners, the situation was particularly difficult. They were usually housed separately from men, often in smaller, more isolated cells. They faced additional dangers from guards and male prisoners. Pregnant women might give birth in prison, their children either dying quickly in the harsh conditions or being taken away. The shame of imprisonment fell particularly heavily on women, whose reputations could be destroyed merely by association with the criminal justice system. Children, too, found themselves in dungeons, either for their own crimes or accompanying imprisoned parents. The medieval justice system made few allowances for youth. Children as young as 7 could be held responsible for crimes, though they might receive lighter punishments. Seeing children in chains, competing with adults for food and space, adds another layer of horror to our understanding of medieval imprisonment. The dungeon served purposes beyond mere containment. It was a tool of interrogation, where the harsh conditions might loosen tongues without formal torture. It was a means of punishment in itself, where pre-trial detention might be so awful that prisoners would confess simply to move on to execution. It was a source of revenue for those who operated it, and it was a symbol of power, a reminder that the Lord's justice could not only kill, but could consign one to a living death. As we contemplate these spaces of despair, we might reflect on how architecture can embody and enforce power relations. The dungeon of St. Aliquis, with its carefully designed levels of misery, its systems of payment and privilege, even within imprisonment, its casual cruelty and occasional mercy, shows us medieval society in microcosm. Here, stripped of pretense and comfort, the fundamental relations of power, wealth, and human nature were laid bare. The prisoners who inhabited these spaces were not statistics but individuals, each with their own story, their own suffering, their own strategies for survival, some guilty, some innocent, some uncertain even themselves of their culpability. They endured conditions that test our understanding of human endurance. Their stories, largely unrecorded, form a hidden history of medieval justice, a history written in chains and darkness, in disease and despair, but also in resilience and rough solidarity. As we prepare to ascend from these depths, leaving behind the dripping stones and clanking chains, we carry with us the knowledge of what lay beneath the surface of medieval society. The dungeon was not an aberration, but an integral part of the justice system, as necessary to its function as the court and the scaffold. In its darkness, we see reflected the shadows of a society that believed suffering could produce truth, that imprisonment could lead to redemption, and that justice sometimes required the slow destruction of both body and soul.